June 28, 2008 was just like any other busy Saturday at Six Flags over Georgia. Lines for all the rides were long, but the line for Batman the Ride was especially long. The ride is an inverted coaster made by B&M. Added in 1997, in 2008 it was still one of the most popular rides in the park. By 1 p.m. the line for Batman was up to 120 minutes. A large group of teen boys was visiting the park that day with a church group. The group entered the line for Batman around 1:40 p.m. What happened next is not exactly clear, but it is known that the group of boys attempted to get ahead of the line by jumping over some fences around the ride. The group eventually ended up right here, right along the perimeter fence of the ride near the parking lot. Due to the danger presented by the ride inside of these fences, Six Flags had placed a security position near the fence in the parking lot. The security officer stationed there noticed 2 of the boys inside the fence, as well as 4 others walking around the outside of the fence talking to the group inside. Security told the boys outside the fence to leave and had the group inside the fence return to the ride queue line. It's worth noting that the group of 2 inside the fence were not in immediate danger, as they were not directly in a ride danger zone, just a restricted area not intended for unauthorized access. As security was escorting this group of 2 back to the queue line, they noticed another boy in the ride's danger zone, directly under the operating ride, apparently attempting to reach the group security was escorting. Security ran over to the boy in the ride area. By the time they got there, they saw one boy running away rapidly from the ride and another boy laying on the ground motionless as the coaster train flew by. Guests in the Flash Pass line were able to fully witness the event. The Flash Pass attendant and several guests from the Flash Pass line ran up to the station to tell the crew to stop operation and that someone had been hit. Seconds later, security arrived and directed the crew to clear the ride area of all guests and evacuate the riders still on the ride. Security secured the area and found that the guest hit by the ride was decapitated. They gathered statements from guests who witnessed the event. One of those statements is shown here.
I saw a man run from the building, Batman, towards the fence. He jumped the fence and ran under the ride. He was hit by the ride, or one person on the ride, and fell forward. He didn't get up.
This story was corroborated by another guest who was taken to guest services for new clothing after the ride due to him finding what appeared to be blood on his clothes. Security later interviewed this guest.
The guest arrived at the security office and he had changed clothing. I asked where was the clothing he had on and he handed me a bag. I asked him what he saw and he stated that he was on the ride and he saw a body running. He said when the ride stopped he noticed that he had what appeared to be blood on his clothing.
In spring of 2007, Expoland maintenance workers took the trains for Fujin Raijin 2 apart for their annual inspection. They made a visual inspection of various parts of the ride, much like they had done for years. As they put the trains for the ride back together, they used glue to hold the wheel axles in place, as by this point only 1/3 of the original cross-section of the axle was still in contact with the bearing inside the car. The 2 trains of the ride were rebuilt in this way and replaced on the ride's track. The ride then reopened for the 2007 season. At around 1 p.m. on May 5, 2007, Fujin Raijin 2 was loaded with 20 riders, leaving 4 empty seats. The ride dispatched from the station and climbed its 141-foot-tall chain lift hill. The train detached from the lift hill and the blue Fujin train fell down the first drop, as it had done hundreds of thousands of times before. The bottom of this drop put roughly 3 positive G's of stress on the train. The ride rocketed up its second hill, and the train experienced a moment of negative G-forces. At the top of this hill, the 15-year-old wheel axle on the left side of car 2, worn out by being subjected to these forces so many times, finally snapped. Though the wheel assembly was still connected to the train simply through friction. The train continued through the ride's rough and jerky twisted layout. Riders on the train likely did not know that anything had gone wrong. The train continued for roughly 500 meters normally. As the ride exited its double helix climb and entered a straight section of track, the wheel assembly finally fell out of the train. This caused the car to immediately tip 45 degrees to its left. This put the top of the train's headrests in contact with the maintenance catwalk handrails. This sudden collision with the maintenance catwalk handrail brought the train from about 15 miles per hour to an immediate stop. The rider in the front of car 2 on the left side was killed instantly as their head was pinned between the maintenance catwalk handrail and the train's headrest. The rider behind them narrowly escaped the same fate and was left with significant injuries. The other 18 riders were injured by the sudden stop, and 15 bystanders were also taken to the hospital due to feeling sick after witnessing the accident. The investigation that followed revealed that Expoland had failed to properly maintain the coaster. Their inspections were not compliant with Japanese law, they had failed to replace parts on the coaster that were well overdue for repair, and they had made unauthorized repairs using glue to avoid replacing parts. It was also discovered that the ride's manufacturer, Togo, had sold a questionable design. The axle itself was made of nickel chromium alloy. This design had a factor of safety between 1.6 and 2.8, meaning it could take around 1.6 to 2.8 times more stress than it was designed to endure without failure. Most parts in the amusement industry are made with a factor of safety of 10 or greater. The Togo design of placing the side friction wheels and uplift wheels a few millimeters away from the track rail resulted in the train slamming side to side and up and down on the track when the train experienced ride forces. When this was repeated thousands of times over the ride's lifetime, it led to excessive strain that eventually broke the axle. Though Togo was not found guilty in this accident, the design they sold was at least questionable. The ride was made by Intamin and had been operating for the last 3 years, with one incident occurring in the past. This incident occurred in 2001, where an airline burst on the ride's final brakes due to a design flaw, causing two trains to collide at moderate speed. The ride's seatbelts were longer in the front row than in other rows, despite no changes being made to the ride's actual restraints in this row. On May 1, 2004, Superman at Six Flags New England was operating normally. The ride was being operated by 3 operators, one in controls, one checking the unload side of the train, and one checking the load side. A rider with several mental and physical impairments attempted to board the ride through the exit using a mobility scooter. The rider boarded the train without assistance, but was unable to secure the seatbelt due to the size of their upper body. The ride operators moved the rider to the front row on the unload side of the ride so they could use the longer seatbelts. They buckled the rider's seatbelt and pushed the T-bar into the rider's gut. The train was dispatched from the station. As the train traversed the layout, the rider in the front row unload side started getting air on some of the negative G moments of the ride. The rider behind them attempted to hold them down to prevent them from being ejected. As the ride was exiting the final airtime hill and banked to the right to make the final turn into the brakes, the rider in the first row unload side was ejected from the ride after being subjected to an instantaneous change from negative 0.4 Gs to positive plus 2.9 Gs. As the rider was ejected from the car, their left hand came in contact with the coaster's rails and the rear wheel assembly on the first car of the train, severing the rider's left hand and part of their left arm. The rest of the rider was flung into a support beam near the end of the ride, where it then traveled another 31 feet before hitting the ground, then going another 38 feet before striking a chain link fence around the ride. Several riders hopped the fence in an attempt to assist the ejected rider. The train returned to the station with the lap bars still in place and the seatbelt still buckled. Park First Aid arrived and assisted with medical care until an ambulance arrived. The riders succumbed to their injuries and the ride was closed for investigation. On October 27, 2023, Bullet Coaster was operating normally, or as normally as it was capable of operating at this time. The ride had received a major refurbishment from Run Chain Group a few months prior. However, with little work being performed, the ride was still well overdue for several major overhauls, including the replacement of every raisable magnetic brake fin and mechanism on the launch track, as these parts were now over 14 months expired. Train number 1 was loaded with guests and moved into the launch track. Behind it, train number 2 pulled into the station and began to unload. Train number 1 connected to the launch system and was launched. Partway through this launch, the computer system, also in disrepair, detected some kind of problem and aborted the launch. This caused the magnetic brakes to raise and the launch to stop accelerating the train. The train passed over the brake fins and slowed slightly before going partway up the first hill. The train fell backwards down the first hill and back into the launch track area. Brake fin number 1 at the end of the launch track was out of true with the magnetic brake under the train due to a loose bolt on the brake fin breaking when the train last passed over it right after the launch was aborted. This caused it to scrape against the set of permanent magnetic brakes under the train and caused the brakes to be destroyed. This made them ineffective as the train passed over the remaining magnetic brakes. The train continued moving backwards at great speed towards the station. Just before the station, it hit a set of feeder wheels designed to slow or stop the train at low speeds. The train slowed slightly but still flew through these wheels and collided with the still unloading train number 2 and sent it flying backwards out of the station and into the braking area into a set of mechanical brakes. Train number 1 would eventually come to a stop in the station after partially derailing. Riders on train number 2 were still getting off the train when it was hit. This caused some of the riders to be thrown from the train, while others remained in train number 2 and felt the full force of the collision. All riders in train number 1 remained secure by their lap bars, but were subjected to the force of the trains crashing. Happy Valley ride operators called for help. Maintenance employees arrived before rescue services and disconnected main power to the ride. Due to poor upkeep, the system for storing data from the ride's computer was not backed up, meaning that data from the control system on the crash was deleted when this happened. 28 riders on both trains were injured, 3 seriously, all from train number 2. As of December 2023, 3 riders were still in the hospital. Around 5:38 p.m. on Thursday, March 6, 2014, OPA was operating normally. 4 guests entered the queue line for OPA and went to board the attraction. When they approached the station, one of the guests asked the ride operator if all 4 of them could ride in one car. The operator said that they could and continued to load them into the yellow car. The operator checked all 4 lap bars and dispatched the car as normal. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first, but at some point near the end of the ride during the section where the car spins, the rider in seat number 1 was thrown from the car. The rider fell almost 17 feet onto the concrete floor. One witness reported that the rider struck 3 poles during the fall. A manager from Mount Olympus, who was standing right next to the ride, immediately initiated Mount Olympus's emergency action plan and responded to the scene. One of the bystanders called 911. By the time the police arrived, there were multiple people tending to the guest. The guest was transported to a nearby hospital emergency room, but later flown to a trauma center due to their injuries. The guest survived, but sustained lifelong injuries. The police began the investigation into what caused the accident and gathered witness statements from multiple Mount Olympus employees and guests. They found during the morning tests 3 of the cars were swapped out for the other 3 cars. Park maintenance also told the operator specifically not to operate the red car because it was having issues with the lap bars coming unlocked. One of the police officers responding to the accident took photos of the car for the investigation and pulled on the lap bars to see if he could find any issues. The 3 lap bars for seats 2, 3, and 4 all remained down in their locked position and appeared to be working properly. However, the lap bar for seat number 1, which was the same one that the rider was sitting in, came unlocked, and the officer noted that it appeared the locking mechanism was stripped. The officer double-checked the lap bars and got the same results, with seat number 1's lap bar coming unlocked when force was applied against it. Sandblaster was created with a very simple and flimsy safety wheel design in the mid-1970s. The ride operated at several locations before being bought and refurbished by Boardwalk Amusements in 2013. The refurbishment included adding magnetic brakes and disabling the ride's mechanical brakes. Less magnetic brakes were added than needed and the ride ran over speed. Several safety wheel escape events occurred under the ownership of Boardwalk Amusements, including at least one event prior to this accident where the brake fin collided with the magnetic brake structure. These accidents were covered up so that the ride was able to pass state inspection. On June 14, 2018, around 8 p.m., a nearly full Sandblaster train was dispatched. When it entered the bottom half of the ride's second 540-degree spiral as the track began to unbank, the negative G's created by the overspeed car caused the right side front lead safety wheel to tunnel a channel in the track and escape. The car was now moving with a strong leftward tilt as it entered the straightaway. The front car's brake fin struck the magnetic brake structure as it was no longer in alignment with the brake. This detached the brake fin and sent the lead car off the track to the right. The impact partially derailed the second car. The lead car's second row struck a support on its way down. The riders in the front row of the front car fell roughly 17 feet to the ground due to the inadequate design of the aftermarket seatbelt. On July 8, 2011, Ride of Steel was operating normally. Around 4:05 p.m., a guest who was in a wheelchair, missing all of their left leg, part of their left hip, and had their right leg amputated above the knee, visited guest relations and asked about boarding policies for guests with disabilities. Guest relations explained the policy at the park that allowed guests with certain disabilities to go up the exit of attractions. They offered the guest a brochure about ADA at the park and explained further what rides could accommodate certain body types. The guests declined this brochure, stating they already had one. It was never determined if this actually was the case. Before leaving guest relations, the staff explained to the guests that they would need to transfer to all ride units without help from staff members. At this point, the guest left guest relations and went out into the park. At around 5:30 p.m., they went up the exit for Ride of Steel, passing a warning sign that stated that riders with the same body dimensions as the rider that was attempting to board were not permitted to ride. The operator on the unload side of the platform signaled to the operator in controls not to open the gates on the next train, as there were guests in the exit waiting to be boarded. The red train pulled into the station and the guests in the exit were boarded. A relative of the guest with leg amputations assisted the rider with disabilities into row 11 of the ride. The loading gates were then opened and riders from the standby line filled the remaining 30 seats. The train was then checked by the two operators. This included one operator directly checking the seatbelt and lap bar of the guest with one missing leg. The red train was dispatched from the station. The rider stayed secure for the first 2 moments of negative G-forces on the first drop and first airtime hill. But as the train exited the first helix and crested the second airtime hill, the strong negative G-forces combined with the restraint's inability to secure riders without contact to their legs threw them from the train. The ejected rider fell to the ground below and was killed instantly after impacting the ground. The red train returned to the station and rolled right in, as the blue train had already been loaded and dispatched by the time the red train returned. Riders on the red train alerted the operators to what had happened. The operators opted to continue to cycle the ride and unload riders, allowing the blue train to crest over the lift. The fully loaded blue train completed the ride layout without incident, passing the scene of the accident on the previous train. The red train was emptied of riders and sent around empty to allow for the blue train to return to the station for unloading. This not only destroyed any kind of evidence that may have been left on the red train, but it also potentially endangered riders on the blue train, as at this point no one was aware as to what caused the accident or where the ejected rider was. On September 5, 2003, Big Thunder Mountain Railroad at the Disneyland Resort suffered a catastrophic failure that resulted in train number 2 derailing and killing one of the 2 riders seated in the front row. The derailment was caused by a maintenance technician signing off train number 2 for service, even though it had not been properly maintained. When train number 2 entered service, 2 bolts on the front of the decorative locomotive car holding the bottom half of the left wheel assembly were loose, and the safety wire, intended as a backup to the bolts, was not installed. After a few cycles, one of the 2 retaining bolts unthreaded itself due to vibration from the train traversing the layout. This left just one bolt holding the guide and upstop wheel to the floating axle on the front of the decorative locomotive car. On the 12th cycle of the day, the other retaining bolt failed and the guide and upstop wheel on the left side of the floating axle for the decorative locomotive car fell to the ground. The floating axle now had nothing to prevent it from sliding too far to the left, or from moving too high in moments of negative G. Riders were loaded for the 13th cycle of the day for train number 2. The train left the station and traversed the first third of the layout before entering a high-speed right turn. This turn caused the floating axle on the front of the decorative locomotive car to shift further to the left than designed. The right wheel assembly made contact with the track and the front car began to bounce and move erratically. After this high-speed turn, the train entered an uphill section surrounded by a tunnel with brakes placed on the track. The now derailed but still moving at a high speed decorative locomotive car struck these brakes, causing one to break free of the track. Near the top of the small hill, the decorative locomotive became lodged into the track. The force of this was so strong that the couplings that attached the decorative locomotive to the other cars broke loose. This caused the first passenger car to slam into the decorative locomotive. The impact killed a rider in the first row and injured several others. The collision also derailed the third car of the train. At this point, most of the speed was lost and the remaining cars coasted slowly down the hill into the brakes, stopping the train. Around 6:40 p.m. on Friday, July 19, 2013, New Texas Giant was operating normally. A larger, female rider entered the queue line with 2 of her family members. This rider did not speak any English. The rider and her family loaded into the third row of the red train where their restraints were checked by the attendants on the ride's platform. One attendant checked the rider's restraint but believed it may be too high. The attendant walked over to the ride's control panel and observed that the seat sensor indicator light was on, indicating that the rider's seat was properly secured according to the ride's control system. If there had been a malfunction with this sensor, the train would not be allowed to dispatch from the station. After the attendants checked the remaining seats on the train by pushing and pulling on the lap bars, they retreated to a safe zone and pressed their dispatch enable buttons. The supervisor then pressed their dispatch button and the train left the station, with the control system reading that every restraint was down and locked. The train ascended the lift hill and crested over the drop as normal. As the train proceeded into its first hill, the female rider in the third row became unsecured from the restraint and was thrown forward as the train ascended its first overbank turn, possibly knocking her unconscious. Some of the witnesses on the train stated that she was flipped upside down, with her legs in the air and her head near the floor of the train. At this point, there was no way she could hold herself into the ride, and as the train exited the first overbank, she was thrown from the ride. She fell roughly 75 feet and came into contact with multiple ride supports before landing on the roof of the ride's second tunnel below. Due to the multiple impacts with supports of the ride, her body was nearly cut in half by the time it landed on the second tunnel. The train continued all the way through the rest of the layout without any issues and returned to the station. As the train was pulling into the station, the riders on board were panicked and informed the ride operators that a rider in the third row was thrown from the train. The load side operator let off their dispatch enable button, which caused the train to stop before fully parking in the station. They then observed the ride area to see if they could see the rider. However, the rider was unable to be seen from the station, so the train was moved forward and unloaded. The ride was unloaded completely, and one of the operators completed a walk of the ride's track and found the ejected rider on top of the second tunnel. On August 3, 2023, around 3:30 p.m., Galaxy Spin at Fun Spot Kissimmee was operating normally. 3 riders, all children but taller than 48 inches, boarded the ride, passing several signs that warned against standing up. The smallest of these riders was measured by the ride's operator and found to be just over 48 inches tall. The riders were loaded into a car on Galaxy Spin, and the operator checked their restraints by pushing and pulling on the lap bar. The car was dispatched from the station, and the operator watched as all 3 riders remained seated properly until they were out of their view. The ride completed the first half of the cycle normally. Sometime in the second half of the ride, around where the car began spinning, the smallest rider in the group moved in a way that allowed them to become free from under the lap bar restraint. As the ride navigated the first hairpin turn on the second level, the rider was ejected as they were standing outside of the lap bar and near the exit of the ride vehicle. They fell to the ground about 20 feet below, landing on a support beam at the bottom of the ride. The ride was emergency stopped by the operator after hearing about the ejection from other guests that ran up to the platform. First responders attended to the ejected rider, and the other riders were evacuated from the cars stopped on the control points of the ride.